Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to be going over the history and geography of Estonia. And I've got a pencil here to point out all the things for you in Estonia. I don't have a book for you tonight, but I will eventually. My library, literally, I was going to film this video last week, and then I just randomly checked my library database, and they had just gotten in a big book about Estonia, like the kind that I show you after I do the history. So I'm still waiting for that to come in. It's still out on order, so whenever it eventually does come in, I'll just do another video showing you the pictures and reading you the boxes and things like that about Estonia. So we'll wait on pictures until then. Hopefully it's sooner than later. So anyway, tonight's just going to be history and geography. I do have a book for you tomorrow. I actually have it right here that I'll whisper to you. It just doesn't have really great pictures in it, but it's a really good whisper book. So anyway, Estonia is located in northern Europe, kind of northeastern Europe. You can see the border here with Russia and a border here with Latvia, and it borders the Baltic Sea. Estonia in general is a pretty flat country. You can see the highest point right here is Suurmunamägi. It's only 10,000 feet, which is pretty small compared to most big mountains. It's a very kind of wet, marshy, boggy kind of country. Very flat, very forested also. There are a lot of rivers, as you can see. The most important would be the Narva River. You can see right here by the town of Narva. And the Parnu River going through here, which is near the city of Parnu, which from what I understand is like the big summertime beach city in Estonia. Otherwise, the largest lake you can see right here is Lake Peipus, which is divided between Estonia and Russia. Very big lake. And of course it has this big long coastline up here. And Estonia has lots of islands around it. The biggest and the most important being Saaremaa. You can see right here, Saaremaa. There's also Hiiumaa, which is pretty famous for, I think Saaremaa has it too, when it gets cold. The water freezes over and it's strong enough that you can drive across it to the islands, which is pretty neat. I would be way too chicken to do that, I think. But yeah, it has lots of interesting islands. You can see the capital city here on the coastline. This is Tallinn. Very large, beautiful city. Actually, if I can slide this over, let's see if it'll let me. Carefully. There we go. There's a picture of, this is the town hall square in Tallinn. Oop, my notes are in the way. Slide it back carefully. Okay. That was an up close version of Estonia you could see there. And Tallinn is not the only capital. It is officially, but Tartu is considered the cultural capital of Estonia. It's very a little bit older than Tallinn by a couple hundred years, and like I said, it has the more Estonian culture to it. Okay, that's probably where we're going to be for tonight. Okay, I shouldn't have moved the book, but oh well. Anyway, that's about it for geography. It's not a very large country, but it is a very interesting one, so let's talk about its history. Being so far north, this was basically all covered by ice up until all of the glaciers melted, and the first humans would have come around 13,000 to 11,000 years ago. The oldest known settlement would be along the Parnu River here, about this area. By 1800 BCE was when the ancient people here established hill forts, which became like a big part of their culture for hundreds of thousands of years, honestly. The hill forts, as you can imagine, were forts on hills, but they had the farms around it, and they'd all have their own little societies and stuff. I want to get this more centered. I shouldn't have moved the book. Anyway. Okay. Is it crooked? I can't tell. Anyway. Hill forts, right? After these hill fort regions built up and became more powerful and powerful, it led to what's known historically as the Estonian Vikings, which were mainly based out on the islands here, particularly Saaremaa. They focused most of their attacks on Scandinavia, and they lasted for quite a while. They even fought the official Vikings after a point. By the year 1030, the people, or the culture known as the Kievan Rus, came through. They established Tartu, and they were very much attacked by the Estonian Vikings. At this point, they were known as Osilians, I believe it's pronounced. But yeah, they didn't want people coming into their land and taking over. However, in 1199, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade on this region of Europe, since these people were still very pagan, and a group of crusaders who were then known as the German Livonian Brothers of the Sword fought through this area. They conquered the area and conquered Saaremaa by 1277. This area went by a lot of names. Estonia today was broken up into various different parts that were controlled by various different peoples, but in a nutshell, the region was known as Livonia, and it was under the control of what they were then called the Livonian Knights. And in the 1300s, the city of Tallinn was established. It was basically a trade link between Novgorod and what is now Russia and the Hanseatic League up in Scandinavia, which were the big trading markets in this region. So Tallinn was kind of like the halfway point. Hello, Rooster. There were also a lot of rebellions against the Livonian Knights throughout the 1300s, which the Livonian Knights would, keep putting them down. But after one big one, this is, again, a very basic history. I'm not going into too much detail here. After a big rebellion, the people here defeated the Livonian Order in 1435 and started doing their own thing. When I say the people, I mean mostly the trade guilds and powerful merchants and peoples in charge of their own regions of the land rose up and took over control of the land for themselves. In the 1530s, this is during the whole Reformation, Protestantism came into the area and was very much embraced because people could worship in Estonian at that point. They didn't have to do it in Latin, and they didn't have any kind of foreign influence in their church. They could just control themselves. In 1558, Tsar Ivan the Terrible invaded and sparked what's known as the Livonian War. So the different nobles all throughout the region went to get some help from some other neighbors. Some went to Poland, some went to Sweden, some went to Denmark, and they all came together to defeat the Russians in 1583. And then what is now Estonia became divided up between those three nations, and they had total control until 1600, when Poland and Sweden went to war. A lot of the wars were fought in this region, and Sweden took over all of what is now Estonia. And the Swedish actually took pretty good care of the people here. They were still under a very serf-dominated economy, where pretty much all the native peoples here were serfs, except for the ones who were in power, right? And it got a lot better under Swedish control. There was better education, better, infrastructure for the time, like roads and things like that. Until the Great Famine of 1695 to 1697, then it got really bad. It got worse not long after that. In 1700, the Great Northern War broke out, and this region was dominated by the Russians. And the Russians were not so good to the people here. They treated them pretty poorly, like second-class citizens. But they did abolish serfdom in 1816, so that was one very good thing. By the 1850s, the Estonian Great Awakening happened, where people started to take a lot of pride in their heritage and language and really pushed their culture into every aspect of their daily lives. That led to a lot of Russification from the Russians trying to come in and ban their language and enforce their religion, their Orthodox religion, of course, and all of that. You know what I mean. By 1917, World War I is in full swing. They're just kind of up here doing their own thing. So, of course, 1917, if you know your European history, is when the Russian Empire fell to the Bolsheviks, who were communist. So the people here are like, oh cool, the Russians are gone, right? We can start doing our own thing. The Bolsheviks said no. They came in to put a stop to it. And the Germans also were really interested in this region since it was so weak and tried to invade as well. The Estonian people pushed them out, and they declared independence on February 24th, 1918. Just a few months after that, it was almost like immediately the Soviets came in to invade in a big way, because by that point it wasn't just a revolution. They had taken over all of Russia, becoming the Soviet Union. So they swept in to fight, sparking the Estonian War of Independence, which the Estonians won, and they got to keep their independence. There was a coup attempt by the Russians in 1924, but it was stopped. And for a while, Estonia was doing its own thing. In the 1930s, the Great Depression happens, and that led to a lot of economic strife. And that led to a lot of more right-wing politics coming into power and even taking over. But it wasn't as intense as like what was happening in other parts of Europe, like Germany and Spain and Italy. So when World War II happens in 1939, they declare neutrality. They don't pick a side. They just say they're nothing. However, on August 23rd, 1939 is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And that was an agreement between the Soviets and Nazi Germany because, you know, they didn't want to have a full-out war. So they just decided what they could conquer. Instead of conquering it on the battlefield, they're like, let's conquer it through a treaty. So Germany and Russia, well, the Soviets, divided up Europe between what they wanted to conquer, and this area came under the Soviet sphere of influence. And the Estonian government was pretty weak at the time from all of the right-wing takeover and political corruption. At one point, their parliament refused to meet so that political extremists couldn't have control over the government. It was a pretty unstable time politically, so the Soviets took full advantage of that and invaded and annexed Estonia to the Soviet Union in 1940. There was a big guerrilla movement of freedom fighters hiding in the forest, fighting back, but by 1941, that meant nothing because the Germans invaded. And at first they were welcomed as liberators, getting the Russians out, but the Estonians quickly realized that the Germans were far worse for multiple reasons. You can imagine, you know, the things that Germans did during World War II. I don't need to go into it for relaxation purposes. But one of them, besides, you know, the horribleness, was forced conscription. Once the war kind of turned against the Germans and it was getting a little dire, they would force Estonians to join their army and fight for them, which was not great. But yeah, that's on top of, you know, wiping out the Jewish population, the Romani population, and capturing as many Soviets as they could as prisoners of war. All of the horrible things that the Nazi Germans did, of course. The Soviets came through and invaded and reclaimed the area in 1944, and thus began the true Soviet era of Estonia. It wasn't recognized by most nations. They considered the annexation illegal, but invade and take over they did, there was an even bigger Russification movement than even before. They implemented collectivization for the farmland, which meant that farmers were told what they could farm, and they had to give those crops to the government to be evenly distributed. But, that just kind of leads to more chaos when you have a gigantic union like the Soviet Union, right? It's a lot of people to feed, so Estonians weren't getting that food that they were growing. Not to mention, the Soviets would evict a lot of Estonians out of their land so that Russians could move in to sort of implement the Russian culture into the region. And these people were relocated, right, to Siberia and other horrific parts of Russia. But in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union started to weaken, they started to let other countries in the Soviet Union have more political power. Revolution sparked up. And in this region, in the Baltic region up here, the revolution was very peaceful. In 1987, the Singing Revolution started, which, let me carefully move this again. You can see a picture of it up here. You can see the Estonian flag right here. And there is this big stadium in Estonia. All of this fills up with people. And the Estonians have lots and lots of, there we go. They have lots and lots of like cultural folk songs in Estonian. So they would gather together in mass protests and just sing. Like they wouldn't be violent or anything, they would just sing. There would be like human chains, like holding hands across all the Baltic nations here. Just very peaceful mass demonstrations. And as the Soviet Union kept weakening and finally collapsed, Estonia declared its independence on August 20th, 1991. And honestly, Estonia has been doing very excellent in its independence. It's mostly known now for its tech innovation. It's known as more like the Silicon Valley of Europe. There's a lot of tech startups that happen. A lot of technological advances in Estonia. They're very forward-thinking in terms of technology, things like that. It's a very high human development index. And just from what I could tell in researching, it just seems like a very peaceful, very calm and relaxed place to live. So I know I have Estonian viewers, so feel free to chime in on that. If you have anything you want to add or correct, please feel free to do so. I'll pin the best comments from you guys. But in a nutshell, that's the history of Estonia. So like I said, there'll be another video where I'll flip through a book and show lots of pictures of Estonia, read all the little facts about Estonia. It is a brand new book, just published, so it should be all up to date. Very exciting. So yeah, that will come in time once my library gets it in. I'm the first in line for it, eagerly anticipating it. I've been putting off filming this video, hoping that they would get it, but I don't know when it's going to come in, so I gotta keep going with the countries eventually. If you're new to my channel, hello. I'm going over the history of every country in the world, and from what I can tell, just looking at my plan, I'm hoping to have covered every country by this time next year. Fingers crossed. I don't know if it'll happen. I certainly hope so, but anyway. That's going to be it for tonight. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good night.